Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Garrett Smith, Dr. Trent Pomplun, and Dr. Jared Goff to discuss the early stages of intellectual interest and engagement with the thought of John Duns Scotus in the Middle Ages, and the eventual rise of the Scotistic commentarial tradition in the early modern period. We'll be discussing the early followers of Duns Scotus, including some of the figures such as Antonius Andreas, Francis Meyronnes, Petrus Thomae, the sort of later Renaissance figures such as Antonio Trombetta and others, and the early modern Scotistic commentators, most especially Bartolomeo Mastri. Dr. Goff and Dr. Smith are both returning guests to Dogs with Torches, but Dr. Pomplun is joining with us for the first time. And Dr. Pomplun's expertise extends from the late medieval to the early modern thought, with a special emphasis on the 17th and 18th centuries. He has published on the history of scholastic theology, Catholic missions in Asia, and the Indo-Tibetan regions and culture. He is chiefly absorbed in the study of Ippolito Desideri, a Jesuit who lived in Tibet during the early 18th century. When he's not squinting at Tibetan manuscripts, he studies both Eastern and Western traditions of scholasticism. So yeah, I figured maybe we'd begin with some of the early years of intellectual engagement with the thought of Blessed Duns Scotus. Um, Dr. Smith, how exactly would you characterize the early followers of Scotus? Was there any sort of mandated mendicant support given to Scotus during the 14th century? Do we find any support or interest sort of develop organically?
So at least during the medieval period, there's no official Franciscan requirements to follow SCOTUS or anybody else for that matter. Um, so with the Dominicans, you get kind of requirement to follow Thomas as early as like 1282 or something, but the Franciscans never made that official until maybe even the 16th century, I think. At that point, it was you had to follow Bonaventure, Scotus, Meyronnes, and I think Richard Middleton were like the accepted features people. So in the early days, then it was largely just people kind of who were inspired by Scotus's ideas that were largely developing kind of their own views along with Scotus.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, during Scotus's own lifetime, there were a number of people that he kind of interacted with. It's hard to really call them Scotus. I mean, they tend to have largely combination views of Scotus and Henry of Ghent and a number of people. So like James of Ascoli is one, and um, like Anik is kind of William of Anik, who people often say is Scotus' secretary. At the very least, he was involved in the editions of Scotus's works, and had access to works that don't exist anymore. But even Anik is kind of a combination of more like Scotus and Aquinas, and he's quite critical of Scotus at times. There are a number of others like Wilton and Thomas Wilton and Henry Park-Clay that are largely independent. So yeah, so then you don't really get. I think Scotism itself, or at least as a movement, emerges more in kind of response to external critiques. It was in England, it was William of Ockham, and in the continent, it was Peter Ariel. So Ariel was kind of in the Franciscan Studia system. He lectured at Paris in like 1316 to around 18. And he kind of criticized Scotus quite extensively, and so the kind of reaction to Peter Ariely's what I would say is what kind of generated Scotism or like caused the movement to become more concrete.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
like you don't get really like even the like phrase Scotistic school, like the first phrase of that, the Schola Scotica is Petrus Thomae in 1325. Um, and he kind of refers it. I mean, I think he would think of himself as part of that, but at least in that particular place, he's referring probably to Antonius Andreas. But he also refers to the Formalizantes and the Scotisantes. So it seems like there were words they would use to describe themselves at that point as followers of Scotus. So this is the mid 1320s. Um, that are like distinct from other groups. So like Meyronnes is probably the first Scotus, I would say. And he's probably one of the first. So you do get, I mean, so it's okay. So it's bit hard. But if you if you follow just the like lectures in Paris, I mean, so immediately after Ariel is Landulphus Gratialis, and he kind of criticized Ariel in like every point, which he goes against Scotus. So really, Landulphus is very Scotist. And none of his stuff is really edited at this point. I mean, his book too, I think, isn't there's an early print of it. So really, he's probably the first. But in terms of like people who wrote the most and that we know of now, probably Meyronnes would be the first, and he kind of reacts quite extensively to Ariel, and then also just expands into all. I mean, he basically writes all kinds of commentaries on the Mass, on the sentences. He's got sermons. I mean, really, he's one of the most prolific authors of the Middle Ages. But
Mhm.
he does not, as far as I know, does not use such words as Scotisantes. He refers to the Schola Minorum, which I would say is distinct. I think within his mind he still was just thinking of like the Franciscans in general. And so he gets into this debate in 1320 with a Benedictine Thomist, Pierre Roget, and there he yeah that's where he uses the like the Schola Minorum kind of talk, and there he at least gives 2 points of what the Schola Minorum holds, which are the use of the signa rationis through instance of nature, and then the formal rationis, so a version of the formal distinction. So at least you get two kind of like quasi. I mean, it's hard to say that the formal distinction is a doctrine; it's more of a tool, just like the
Mhm.
instance of nature. But at least those are seen as two early points were distinctive to the Schola Minorum, and then of course later the Scotus used this quite extensively.
I see. So it would be fair to say that this is more of a general sociological movement centered around sort of the intellectual climate of what's the kind of literature and kind of discussions that's occurring in the Mendicant friar, the Franciscan Mendicant friars more broadly. There's, there are no Scotistic theses, so to speak, that are being hardline defended at this point. Even if there are some that are identified as these are features of Franciscans.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's hard to say because I mean, compared to what there is, I know so little. But the so at least like if you take University, pretty much like the first like 10 years after Scotus was defending University, it's all friends. Like most of the critiques are not external to Franciscans, so internal Franciscans attacking him, like people he knew and whatnot. So it's just far more extensive. Just
Mm,
the criticism directed at him. Like a lot of it was an internal Franciscan thing, but that shouldn't lead us to think that like the Franciscans were unified in holding Scotus. It was more they were a lot of them were kind of defending the Henry of Ghent's views or quasi Bonaventurian views.
mm.
Um, and then the stuff like the formal distinction is much broader, and that kind of goes back to Bonaventure and Aquinas. So that was, I think, less controversial. And so you still will get people reject Scotus on University, but will still have a version of the formal distinction. So this is like Alexander of Alessandria. It's pretty explicit that he goes sides with Bonaventure on analogy. Um,
Right. So would it be fair to say that university tends to be one of the more controversial positions of SCOTUS that causes a lot of internal dialogue within the Mendicant orders, or are there a number of doctrines that are contested in the early formation, kind of like how we find in with respect to Aquinas, things like the unity of substantial form and things of that sort.
yeah, University is probably the chief among them. I mean, I've studied that one the most, but others like I think the Immaculate Conception was much more largely accepted by the Franciscans in general. It wasn't as internally controversial as University, and yeah, as
Okay.
University is.
And would it be fair to say that I mean, I know that you mentioned that we don't really find the social denomination of Scotist or follower of Scotist this early on, but when we do find it, is it ever something that someone is taking on for themselves, like they're self-describing themselves as a follower of Scotist, or is it coming out as someone who's trying, is it a way of identifying a certain person's position? It's coming from someone responding to or critiquing another person? I mean, where does this denomination of SCOTUS come out of?
Well, so with Meyronnes, I mean, he's using again the Schola Minorum, but it's definitely like his view. Like he's defending the Franciscan view against outsiders in that case.
Hmm.
And then with Peter Thomae, so it's kind of a little unclear if he's endorsing the Schola Scotica or not. I mean, I would think he probably is, but at least the one place he uses it, maybe he's referring to another opinion. But definitely, I think he would be consider himself as part of the Scotisantes. and then he criticizes other people for only being like kind of halfway Scotisantes and not full Scotisantes. Like Anik is considered kind of the all-equaliter Scotisantes, not a full and complete Scotist.
Mm,
Especially on Univocity, it was one thing. I mean, so basically every doctrine in any way connected with Univocity would be adjusted by people in various ways. So very few just had straight, just repeated Scotus view on Univocity. Many of them would modify some part of it. So like Anik accepts the basic claim for Univocity, but then modifies the view of the ultimate differences. And so this by Peter Thomae's view, this disqualifies him to be a Scotist, even though
mm,
he still holds Univocity. Um,
right.
so it's yeah, so definitely you get, and also more to the 15th century. They will also, I mean, you still get the Formalizantes talk and the Scotisantes talk, and there's a further differentiation into the Bonatiste and the Meyroniste. So the followers of Benatus and Meyronnes are seen as having slightly different views than kind of classic Scotiste.
Okay.
That's like 1450s, 60s. You get people talking like, I mean, it's mostly Foxel. I don't know if I've seen anybody besides John Foxel talk that way.
Mm.
But this gets cited a lot in the literature, at least. And I mean, Foxell does say this in a number of works.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that we find among this period that Scotists or people who are, if they are engaging in Scotus, are much more eclectic on the matter. Then there's not much uniformity, even on doctrines such as the Univocity of Being thesis. I really want to maybe do an episode unto itself on Nicholas Bonet because I've very recently Philip Neri Reese came on and we recently discussed kind of his understanding of Univocity and its connections to ens rationis. And it's a very niche topic, but lately it's very pertinent to my research. So maybe a future episode for Nicholas Bonet. But in any case, um, with respect to some of these early figures, would it be at all anachronistic to describe them as students of uh, Duns Scotus? Because of course at the university they're really that's not necessarily how the university model took its form or took its shape. Would it be the case though that lecturers would have sort of students attached to them or students that might be working with them or might be associated with them, or is that at all not what's happening at the university?
Yeah, I think probably not. I mean, what you get is I mean, a master would be as have a Socius assigned to him to kind of help him do stuff. So Scotus, we know from the adhesion list of 1303, it's Thomas, who we don't have any really know who that is or was. And I mean, long probably speculated it was Petrus Thomae, but that seems unlikely. Um, yes, they just were kind of there studying, and then to fulfill a degree, they had to lecture. So like Scotus would lecture, and as far as I can tell, a lot of these lectures were closed. So like you couldn't go to other people's, like
Mm,
other orders lectures. Like Franciscans would just be to Franciscans. But I mean, you still had like the claim is that like Harclay and Wilton came to Paris to go with Scotus, and they were secular, so maybe this isn't really the case. But in any case, yeah, you have to avoid the modern view, which you had like a PhD supervisor and the like supervisee. Like it was not like that at all. It was just Scotus would lecture, and a bunch of people would be in the room, and maybe they like him, maybe they agree with him, maybe not. Um, but they're not really students in any modern sense. You would have kind of people assigned to like be the official like reporter to take down like notes of what he was talking about, and he would look them up, or he would look them over, and then publish them or whatever.
mm.
Um, and
Okay.
so for that, like yeah, so like we know the name of his report of his Socius is Thomas. And Anik was always been associated with him. They seem to have known each other. I mean, they're both from the same province or very from the same area of England, Franciscan province of England, and
Mm,
they would have spoken the same language. And he talks about him so much that it seems I mean he knew him by person. Like he even says, well, so does John of Reading. Though John of Reading actually reports stuff that Scotus told him viva voce. He says, um, so you do get kind of like from the initial group like comments that float down of what stuff he said in class, and sometimes there's this whole also the phenomenon of manuscripts of the annotations on Manu Scotti and whatnot of like his later revisions of stuff. Like Peter Tomei will cite these. Like Peter Tomei has no comments about him personally knowing Scotus, but he cites like a cedula from the Quadlibet, which is kind of an inserted like argument or inserted slip of paper into a manuscript, and then he cites some other stuff of Scotus, which he says were just like basically his autographs, like written by his own hand, and these we have not located, but there's like little traditions that get passed down of which these guys will cite stuff going back to Scotus. Um,
Okay.
but like probably like I suspect Peter Thomae did not know Scotus. Meyronnes, I think, did. I think he might have known Scotus. He's not on the adhesion list, but he might have gone there. He might have been in Paris just like a couple years later. I mean, Scotus was there until 1307.
Mm.
Um, and it's hard to say. I mean, Meyronnes describes a secret doctrine to Scotus that presumably he would only know, assuming Meyronnes isn't making it up, presumably Meyronnes would know that from the oral teaching of Scotus, but I mean, he could
Okay.
also be he could also be making it up, so I don't know. Um, Whereas
Okay.
anybody after that, like I don't think like Benatus knew him personally. I don't think really Caracciolo or Ariel and those people probably knew him personally. It's
Okay.
but like yeah, like Wilton would, Annick would have known him personally, James of Ascoli. Um, Basils was allegedly his favorite student. Um, at least according to Wadding's report. There are problems with that just because his book for the sentences it's only exists in a modern print and it claims it was done in 1313 at Reims, which could be the case. I mean, it's the right time, but book one is heavily related to the sentences of Peter of Navarre, who's like 1320s. It seems unlikely that anyway, we have no manuscripts, so we can't really resolve the dating stuff, but it seems like the Basil's written commentary is dependent on Peter Navarre's commentary in some way, which would put it into the 1320s.
Mm.
Doesn't mean he didn't know Scotus. I mean, Basil's is also not on the adhesion list, so who knows? But there's like 5 or 6 guys we can point to that probably were there in Paris with him. Oxford is not as clear, but at least Paris we can point to the guys on the list. Oh, and Gontarii was there. Alfredo Gontarii was there. He's on the list as the Socius of another master. For some strange reason, though, Gauntry doesn't become a master himself until 1325 or thereabouts. So no one really solved this why you would have like a 20-year gap. But and Gauntry actually says in his colophons that he heard Scotus for a long time and heard him lecture and he's trying to follow Scotus. And of course, we can't mention that without mentioning Antonius Andreas because he's got several colophons in which he says that he's basing his comments on the dicta of Scotus. And I think these are probably also it's also not what people like to think. Antonius is also responding to Ariel in a number of places. So I actually put all of Antonius back into the 1320s, and I suspect he could have known Scotus, but I think it's highly unlikely,
Mm.
since as Courtney points out, the works that Antonius discusses, none of them actually are from when Scotus was a master. So Antonius is very specific that this is stuff from when Scotus was sitting in his magisterial chair, which would be like 1305 to 6, and of course that would just be his basically his quadlibet would be all he would have been doing at that point.
Mm.
And this Antonius is talking about like all of the like logic stuff and even the metaphysics. So all of it seems kind of unlikely. Plus the mere dicta. I mean, Peter Thomae uses dicta just to refer to the Ornatio. So I mean, it could be it's some kind of reference to like the way Scotus composed the Ornatio. Like it's been speculated that was dictated, or at least parts of it are. Anyways, it's all speculation. So
Right. 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 Right.
But yeah, so I mean, most of these people that we think of now as like the early Scotus, I myself would date probably to the 1320s, and then the kind of like people that were there with Scotus at Paris are probably the 1310 to 20ish. Those
Okay.
group, and those are far more independent, but it's hard really to call them Scotist.
Fair. Fair. Okay. And I figure maybe we could go into some of these early figures that you've been mentioning. But before we do, Dr. Pomplun, Dr. Goff, do you have anything to add to this or?
Now, I'll add one short thing that Tim Noon communicated to me once, which I've always found a funny kind of note. When I asked Tim a version of this question many years ago. There was no mandated study of SCOTUS, right? He said yes, of course. I said, well, how do we explain the kind of rise of something that looks kind of like Scotism, or why did it get going? Why the groundswell? Given that we see these people really are happy to criticize him and such within the order. And Tim's explanation was that it just seems that however difficult it is to follow Scotus's writings, he seems to have been a dynamo in the classroom. That it was one of those situations that we all have of professors where we say, well, yeah, I know the writing's kind of difficult, but if you'd just been there in the classroom, And you can make of that what you will, but I thought that was a very funny, a kind of very funny little fact, or
Right.
at the very least, a very funny little supposition. But that's Tim's thought, not my own. I don't have the capacity to judge it, but I always found that entertaining.
Right. I mean, I've personally, in my studies of Scotus, I've always found him extremely difficult to read. So the idea that in the classroom he may have been this, charismatic, like dynamo, as you say, I actually don't find that too hard to believe. Yeah, yeah. And maybe if I could maybe ask one question for you, Dr. Goff. I mean, we've been talking a lot about engagement at around this time with Duns Scotus, but do we find any parallel academic interest with some of the literature with respect sorry, let me phrase this. Do we find any parallels with respect to engagement or interest in the thought of Bonaventure at around this time? I know that eventually we're going to be discussing this more when we get to the sort of early modern commentators, the sort of twinning of both Bonaventure and Scotus's thought. But at around this period of time, do we find any academic interest in Bonaventure? What can you say to that?
Well, yes, I think, at the time of Bonaventure's death, Bonaventure was clearly one of the leading intellectuals and churchmen. He died in 1274 during the Council of Lyon II. And clearly at that point, he had high standing in the church, was close friends with the Pope who was eventually elected after a long interregnum. But even going back before that, and here perhaps is a more historiographical and theological point that may suggest why the transition from Bonaventure to Scotus was seen to be easier and more and smoother than perhaps looking at their writings independently. And I think in terms of ecclesiology, in terms of church politics, clearly Bonaventure was at the top of the heap when he died. And I think there are good historical reasons to assume, because of the discussions with the Byzantine Christians leading up to that council, and then the agreement on paper at the council. I think there's a good case to be made that actually Bonaventure's Trinitarian theology, and here's where we get into more theological aspects, was seen to be more useful, at least, or perhaps more amenable to certain aspects of Byzantine Trinitarian theology. And here's where I think the continuity could have been motivated, because from that council, the lead negotiator for the agreement between the Latin West and the Byzantine East was a disciple of Bonaventure sent to the East in the 1260s to work out this kind of agreement that became rubber stamped at the council. But interestingly, subsequent to the council in 1292, this figure, Jerome of Ascoli, was elected Pope Nicholas IV, the first Franciscan Pope. And between the years 1292 all the way up about until you get to the pontificate of John the 22nd, Franciscans were seen to be kind of leading intellectual figures, but also the preachers in the papal household. And so you have important figures like Matthew Aquasparta, but you have intermediary figures like John Peckham, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. And in terms of Trinitarian theology, you find in common already between Bonaventure and then Scotus, you have in common a kind of emphasis on the priority of the mode or order of origination in the Trinity, which seems to be a common theme between Bonaventure and Scotus. But also you find in those intermediary years between Bonaventure's death and then the kind of the more common acceptance, at least in theology, of Scotus's theology, you have in Bonaventurean theologians, like especially Matthew of Aquasparta, but also John Peckham. You have an interesting concession, which I think probably does follow from the logic of Bonaventure's own thought with respect to the impossible counterfactual concerning the procession of the Holy Spirit. Bonaventure denies that without the filioque, there is not possible to affirm a distinction at the terms of the production of the Son and the Spirit, a distinction between the Son and the Spirit. But interestingly, prior to Scotus, Peckham and Aquasparta actually do anticipate the Scotistic position that if you deny the filioque, well, yes, you're a heretic because you deny the filioque, but you're not a Trinitarian heretic. You don't deny the Trinity. And I think certain other moves that you find alluded to in Scotus or in early Scotistic commentators are certain distinctions that could be argued to be inchoate. With respect to the formal distinction, the use of the disjunctive transcendentals, very clearly in the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ, but of course those were lost. And we don't know how much they were read, but you find these distinctions repeated in both the Itinerarium and the later collations in Hexameron with respect to different modes of analogy, where Bonaventure articulates this one-to-one similitude, distinct from the two-to-two proportionality or the analogy of attribution two in comparison to one. And so it seems as though in Bonaventure's thought, there's already a move towards a kind of formulation of conceptual univocity that distinguishes the item being spoken of from the concept that we use or is employed to speak about that item under consideration. And so I suspect that Franciscans played an important role ecclesiologically, and then already in Bonaventure you find certain moves in the realm of theology that are not as antithetical to later Scotistic refinements and distinctions. And so it perhaps eased that transition because, as you note, even Meyronnes on certain points sides with Bonaventure over Scotus. Like, for example, a clear one is the whether it's possible to have simultaneously faith and knowledge of the same item. Bonaventure affirms it's possible. Scotus, with Thomas, denies that that's possible. If you have knowledge of something, you can't have faith about that same proposition. And Meyronnes seems to side with Bonaventure on this point. So I suspect there was a bit of eclecticism, but I wonder in terms of the mindset of the late 13th, early 14th century schoolmen, because the kind of a topic of priority was the Trinity, that certain moves in Bonaventure were seen as antithetical, that then are taken up in subsequent centuries in the early modern period, and just stated explicitly that Bonaventure already, in a sense, generates or is a impetus for later Scotistic distinctions. So they're able to see continuity in realms of theological questions, especially pertaining to the most important question, the Trinity, that makes the two approaches more amenable than antithetical. And what you find too is in the situation with respect to Leon IV, canonically speaking, in the main, I would say the two most important theologians who actually cite Leon II are Bonaventure and Scotus. And you wonder what the ecclesiological and political situation was for the Franciscan school to so heavily emphasize this statement and this doctrine, whereas it's largely ignored by many other important theologians from the period. But at the same time, when you get to the pontificate of John the 22nd, you have a very important theological shift in the church in general that tends to, with that pontificate, begin to favor St. Thomas against the Franciscans. And I suspect it's probably this twofold kind of the loss of position, while at the same time the impetus to kind of defend the uniquely Franciscan position from a political and theological perspective that now is kind of associated with Scotus. And that particularly is the Immaculate Conception, and then kind of its corollary doctrine, the absolute or unconditioned predestination of Christ. And those become kind of Franciscan calling cards that function both theologically, but also I think it's pretty obvious politically to kind of affirm and stand on kind of these two unique or at least particularly emphasized positions that then come to qualify the Franciscan school. And perhaps this also serves to kind of unify interest in Scotus, while at the same time seeing that many aspects of Bonaventure, especially his Trinitarian theology and his philosophical psychology, are already very close to Scotus and seem to have been influenced in many ways.
Right. I very much like how you made the point that prior to the pontificate of John the 22nd, the Franciscan sort of intellectual tradition was very heavily patroned and taken extremely seriously before that pontificate. And of course, with John the 22nd, there were very, very the Mendicant orders very much butted heads, so to speak, with John the 22nd over a number of issues. And of course, John the 22nd was the one who canonized St. Thomas Aquinas. And maybe this is more a question for you, Dr. Smith, but with respect to these earlier supporters, you might say, of Duns Scotus, do we find at all any academic interest or engagement with some of the more controversial questions with respect to maybe the absolute poverty of Christ or apostolic poverty, or questions of maybe the limits of the temporal power of the Pope? Are any of those questions that like Scotist quote unquote followers are interested in, or do they just not touch those things?
Yeah, no, well, so it depends. At least in the poverty, I mean, that was a massive controversy, of course. I mean, Peter Thomae does have a treatise on poverty, but it's very specific to address to lay people and arguing about, whether or not it's okay for lay people to possess wealth or not. However, Meyronnes was involved in both, I think, politics and the papal stuff. Like he had the patron, I think, one of the kings of Sicily, and he did write some stuff on. I've not looked into it that much myself, if he's directly critiquing Dante or not, but there is some, like, people have contrasted his views with Dante's De Monarchia text. And I mean, I'm actually editing with some students right now a text on Meyronnes on the papal the supremacy of the Pope, and it's interesting because it's actually annotated by Nicholas V, Sixtus IV, another Franciscan Pope of the 15th century, has like marginal annotations in his own hand. So it's like a Pope annotating a papal treatise. Anyway, so certainly Meyronnes is involved. He's one of the most wide-ranging. Like, I don't think most of the other ones I know of have a whole lot to say about that. I don't know of any. So Anik did get into trouble because Anik preached against on the 22nd after that was no longer allowed, and he preached against his view. So he had like some political problems, and yeah, he was protected there by one of the kings of Sicily again, I think, protected him, and eventually I think he did reconcile with John the 22nd. But
Okay,
he just preached a sermon. I don't think he like produced a treatise on it.
that's fair.
I mean, none of the people I think of who are Scotists that I read a lot of wrote anything on poverty. Apart from me, I mean, I don't know even if Meyronnes has anything directly on poverty.
That's fair.
But he does have a lot of political stuff, and he's got commentaries on Augustine and whatnot too, so it comes up there also.
Sure, sure. All right then. Well, maybe we could get to discussing specifically some of these figures that we've all been talking about. In particular, maybe we could begin with Francis Meyronnes. We recently had Father Christian Capes came on to discuss the influence of Roman legal jurisprudence on Meyronnes and how he approaches questions such as Immaculate Conception and that sort of controversy. It was a very interesting discussion. What can you tell us about Francis Meyronnes? What are some of his sort of notable contributions and achievements?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a hard question away. I mean,
Sure.
I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things about him. I mean, he has this like set of disputes with a Dominican in 1320 and this is actually a new genre, I think, it's one of the first examples of the principial debates. He's the only person I know of to comment on all of the Dionysian corpus in the 14th century.
Right.
Since so he's very, you could say he's Neoplatonist, and he's got a lot of interesting views on divine ideas. In University, he's kind of a Scotus, but he makes some modifications. I mean, they're very fine-grained modifications. But he does say so. I think there is kind of a split in early Scotism between those who want to say that being is a quiddity and those who do not want to say this. So Meyronnes and like Benedictus, I mean Benedictus, I think is basically just kind of a systematic version of Meyronnes. I think he's completely dependent, but they think that being is a quiddity, and Peter Thomae and Antonius Andreas are against this view. They we'll say it's a quid and it functions like a quid conceptually, but it's not an actual quidditas. The significance of this is that those who think of being as a quiddity deny that being is analogical, because you can't say quiddities you can't predicate more and less of, or like per prius and posterius, which is the main Franciscan explanation of analogy. So the Meyronnes and Benedictus both deny analogy being. Peter Thomae and Antonius affirm it. Now, it could be the case that like Scotus and they think the analogy is something that obtains outside the soul, but I've not seen any text where they say this. They simply just say it's useless for science, so we're not going to talk about it at all. So it might be that they're not so different than Scotus, but I think Scotus still maintains conceptual analogy. And definitely Peter Thomae and Antonius do.
Right.
And Meyronnes, so yeah, so he's got, I mean, 3 versions of his commentary in the sentences. No one really knows how they relate together. So his first one, the Ab Oriente for book 1, is quite interesting because it's very unique. He says a lot of crazy things there he doesn't say in other places. And the people you would go there and make extracts. A lot of like sections of it get copied out and circulate on their own. Like his stuff on the formal distinction gets picked out and circulates as a treatise on formalities. And the intellect stuff. So, and his early view is that he thinks that Scotus's view is that, so as we know, Scotus says that there's this double primacy in being, the virtual and adequate, and the problem is that you can't have the ultimate differences and all this stuff are outside the scope of being, but they're included in beings. And Meyronnes says that this teaching is just for the masses, for the vulgi, and that Scotus in fact thought there was no object intellect at all. And then Meyronnes builds on this and says that for him, he thinks that the object intellect is intelligibility, which is something, of course, that becomes one of the super transcendentals much later. But Meyronnes seems to be one of the first to say this, that the object intellect isn't. Now, I think he drops this later on, but at least in his very earliest view, this is kind of his view.
Okay. I think it's very interesting that he's one of the very he's one of these Scotistic figures that writes an extensive commentary on the writings of Dionysius the Areopagite, the Dionysian corpus, because obviously you'll hear sort of as a popular narrative that this sort of Neoplatonizing of analogy is placed in contradistinction with what's developed in Scotus with conceptual univocity, and with Meyronnes, he doesn't really see as much of a contrast in this. And if I remember exegetically, he seems to think that the writings of the Dionysian corpus supports his own view when it comes to conceptual univocity.
Yeah, I mean, he uses, yeah.
Whether that is exegetically justifiable, of course, I could never in a million years make that call. But I'm just saying that Meyronnes is sort of interested in sort of seeing these two as being more in close continuity than might be surmised.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I was just trying to think of where he discusses them. I mean, he does use Dionysius a fair bit when he's talking about univocity, but it's kind of bare bones. But in the I mean, he does. I mean, it's funny because you get from Gilles Son, we get this Exodus metaphysics stuff, and that really seems to be more found among the Scotists than the Thomists. So like at least in the Divine Names commentary of Meyronnes, he does go into this quite extensively and talk about the ego sum qui sum is kind of the primary name of God, and that this means, so he does have the like God is the primary instance of being, all this kind of talk you'd expect. So he's definitely against the like whole idea that God is beyond being. He's got a whole he's got a whole question that I found somewhere, arguing that God in fact is a being, and yeah, it's very contra. Well, so it's explicitly contra Ariel, but also you could say it's contra David Bentley Hart also, and
Yes,
the modern kind of Neoplatonizing versions of Christianity. Because this comes out of a Dionysian commentary that he's making this claim that the being is a prime name of God and God is not beyond being and whatnot. So and he's just citing Exodus and so on. So
that is interesting. I mean, if I remember the sort of the terminology of God is not a being among beings. That is actually a phrase that Bonaventure himself uses, at least on one occasion. I could be completely wrong about that, but I vaguely remember Uh,
No, he does. Well, so what he says is that God is not ens inter entia, said super entia. But if you're a Thomist, you can still critique that and say that still puts God in a continuum in some way, and that it's still bad. But that is what Bonaventure says. Like Bonaventure's the only person I know of who actually, yeah, uses the phrase "being among beings." Um,
okay,
so I think you are correct there.
interesting. Yeah, and maybe this other Thomist we've been mentioning here and there, Petrus Thomae. I mean, what can you tell us about his contributions to Scotism? Because as I understand, you know, you've done a lot of work with Petrus Thomae, and specifically with regards to his very lengthy treatise on univocity analogy and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. Where to begin?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's another feature of some of these early guys that a lot of them tend to abandon the sentences genre and write kind of independent treatise on things. So Meyronnes himself, I think, does. I mean, he also has a sentences commentary, and he also has like 1,000 commentaries. So he's a bad example, but he does also have write kind of independent, non-Quaestio format treatises on univocity that I was trying to edit. Um, Peter Tome, I mean, yeah, so he's from Galicia, and he it's not clear if he went to Paris, not clear if he knew Scotus. He mentions he knew Scotus' autographs, as I said. Um, he eventually ends up in Avignon on the 22nd, gets accused of necromancy and goes to jail and dies in prison. And then
Oh,
yeah, he wrote a number of about 8 or 9 separate philosophical investigations, and 2 of them are theological. So he's got the Liber de Divite Christiano and the Liber de Originale Innocentia Virginis. Most of the others are philosophical, so one's on, and they're all like scotistic type issues. So one's on minor unity, one's on being, one's on distinctions. Um, it's got a quadlibet and a treatise on intelligible being, which I also edited. Um, and yeah, so I mean, he's kind of definitely has strong familiarity with the like literal works of Scotus and will cite them verbatim, such that you can even like I mean, it was a section I kind of dropped from the Dante volume because it was already 600 pages, but I could even localize the like manuscripts of Scotus he was using to the like the early group of manuscripts that we have now, kind of the early manuscript tradition he had access to. Um, yeah, and then
right.
with respect to like yeah, so like the I mean, intelligible being questions, I mean, are quite interesting because he develops the whole kind of notion of objective being and subjective being, and also the idea of nothingness. He has like extensive discussions of what he calls nihilaitas, and how in the abstract nihilitates. Now the Dante is a little different, so it's not really about univocity. Like univocity comes up, but it's just about kind of the problem of being. It's kind of organized more in which he talks about the concept of being itself and then the properties of being, which he does use the Bonaventurian language and he does use the Bonaventurian kind of arguments for the using the disjunct for transcendentals.
Mm,
So certainly he's a Scotist, but he I think knows his Bonaventure. Um,
gotcha.
and then
Gotcha.
and then right, and then I mean you do get univocity, but it's kind of univocity as insofar as it affects the concept of being. So he goes through basically just analyzing different properties that accrue to the concept of being. Um, until finally he has questions on the ultimate differences and then the real being versus being of reason issue.
Mm,
Um, and then I mean, yeah, so he's like very concerned to establish that there's a single concept of being, as opposed to like the contemporary Thomist view of the time, which held that being was always a disjunct, that it's you're never going to get a concept of being, it's always going to be substance or accidents. You're never going to get any concept that's distinct from any of the categories. So this is like Gerardo Bologna, the Carmelite, and Hervaeus and Taos hold this view. So he's always as far as the Thomists are concerned, he's interacting with that view.
okay.
Um, he does, I mean, he does go against Scotus in some sense, and that he seems to. There was a critique against Scotus. This is where it gets very kind of maybe absurdly detailed, but I won't go too long. But yeah, so you have this argument Scotus that the first argument for univocity, the certain adelphal concept, which is you get the conclusion of this in Scotus, the conclusion mind, only the conclusion is that therefore being is both distinct from and univocal to the concepts of God and creatures. So like Scotus kind of does 2 things in the conclusion of that argument. This is true of all versions of this argument. Like I've gone through all of them. It seems it's always the case that he always thinks that his argument yields both that you get a distinct concept of being and that it's univocal. And then the early generation of Thomists were quite happy to accept that you could get some of them. Okay, so this is not the disjunctivists like Hervaeus and Gerardo Bologna, but you had this other group that were quite happy, like Ariel. Okay, he's not a Thomist, but Ariel and a couple Thomists were quite happy to accept that. Well, okay, so we can have a single concept of being, but we're going to block your univocity claim there, and so they're like accept all of his argument up to a certain point and just say
Right.
it's we'll just say that Cajetan does this too. He says you can have a single concept being, okay, but it's analogical. It's not univocal. Like we're going to block that last inference. And so like what Peter Thomae tries to do is he basically has this massive, I mean, it's like a 30-page question just on that argument of Scotus, analyzing. So he goes like through like 15 objections from Franciscan, outside the Franciscans, all over the place. Um,
Mhm.
to try to develop a version, and eventually he sides with the critics. So like he sides with Ariel, all the critics, and says, okay, yes, Scotus is kind of wrong here, or at least he's trying to prove too much. And so like he formulates a version of this such that it yields kind of absolutely the concept of being as its own concept. And then he says, so that's like question 5. Then he doesn't get around to talking about univocity to question 10 of the De Ante. There he says, okay, so Scotus' argument works. You can look back at question 5. We have to add a definition of univocity in to make it clear that's what we're talking about. So he just adds the like Aristotelian definition of univocity in. This is I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's also kind of a problem because in Scotus, Scotus has his 2 conditions for univocal concept before he starts the argument. I think this was widely misunderstood, like what those 2 conditions were doing, or
Mhm.
I mean, even now nobody agrees what to call these things. Like I call them conditions just because that's what I've always called them, but like Pini would
Right.
disagree with their conditions. So what those things are, I mean, really, I think they're like axioms or stipulations or something. These were largely kind of no one really know what to do with them. And
Okay.
so like what Meyronnes does now is he does something different. What he does is he drops those 2 conditions, but he builds them into the major premise of the same argument against Ariel. So he's also worried about the same argument that Ariel is attacking him on, but his response is just to say that, well, in the first premise, when we say that you can't be certain and doubtful at the same concept, Meyronnes adds this, therefore whatever you're talking about in the content of that concept is univocal between the certain and the doubtful. So Meyronnes builds univocity into the major premise, whereas Peter Thomae adds it in as the second condition to the conclusion. And all this is to meet actually a group of like Thomists and Franciscans who are attacking one argument of Scotus. So this gives you kind of an idea that what is happening pretty much on every page of Peter Thomae's De Ente is like extremely fine-grained arguments against very specific critiques and positions. And I mean, he develops all his arguments in terms of like very like orderly theses,
Mhm.
that all have like sub-arguments. And this, I think, I mean, so it's just the way his own mind works. And you get this also from Meyronnes, like in some of his early writings, he uses kind of an axiomatic approach and just has like 15 axioms about the concept of being that he'll then use to talk about analogy and univocity later on.
Mhm.
And like the principle of non-contradiction we built in there and so on. Um,
Gotcha. Okay.
yeah.
Then maybe we could devote an episode to Petrus Thomae's theories of univocity and analogy, because I mean I think that you're right, especially with sort of Dominican Thomist equivalents, that there do seem to be, especially like in the 15th century, figures like Dominic of Flanders, Paul Sextinus, and eventually Cajetan, who are kind of comfortable with, and even Capriolus to a certain extent, they are all very comfortable with affirming a single concept of being, but it's really, some of them will say that's not enough to prove univocity. Some will say that it's an unequal participation in being. Some people will sort of there's a whole debate about whether or not it's a separate concept from our from concepts of being, and it just keeps going on and on and on. So
Yeah,
in any case, yeah.
you can find all of that in the Dante also. Like he's got a whole question because the thing I just discussed was just like what he thinks of one of Scotus' arguments, but he's got other questions about his own view, which is that he's got his own way to prove that you can have a single act of thinking that yields a single concept of being, and then once you've got that, only then can you talk about univocity and equivocity and so on. And then of course he also does think that univocity and analogy are compatible,
Mm,
which is kind of the common Scotus view anyway, except for Meyronnes and Benetus.
okay, interesting. All right. Well, I think that might be enough for discussing kind of the the sort of early intellectual engagement with Duns Scotus, I figured maybe we could shift to discussing kind of the more like late 15th, early 16th century, maybe the Renaissance period. And Dr. Pomplun, Dr. Goff, jump in if you need to. But Dr. Smith, how exactly would you characterize Scotism kind of in this late Renaissance period? Do we start to find any development of commentarial literature for Scotus the way we find for Thomas Aquinas? Because of course, Cajetan Ferrariensis will make these very lengthy and very intricate commentaries on the Summa Theologiae or the Summa Contra Gentiles. But do we find any parallels for Scotus at around this period of time?
So most of the 15th century stuff I've read is still largely people writing their own sentences, commentaries, and doing
Okay.
lectures, and they'll still talk about Scotus a lot. I mean, it really seemed to have been kind of an age of scholarship rather than creativity.
Okay,
So,
fair.
and even I think actually the universities was not even important. Like most of them don't even talk about it, or it's assumed. But like there was a group in Erfurt in like the 1420s to like 50s lecturing, and they all kind of were Scotist, and but they're all writing like their own sentences. I mean, what takes off is kind of this idea of the discussing the formal distinction as a separate thing. So it becomes its own like genre, the like formalitatis treatises. So really the 15th century, in terms of like surviving manuscripts, there's massive numbers of both anonymous formalitatis treatises, but also various versions of Peter Thomae. Because Peter Thomae, actually, the Univasius might not even be as interesting in Peter Thomae as his theory of distinctions, because he works up seven kinds of distinction. In all, where Scotus had three, but Peter Thomae's got seven, and Meyronnes has four. So that's, I guess, for another podcast. But so in the 15th century, I mean, it's like massive numbers of these like formalities treatises and just manuscripts from the 14th century. Like, but it's definitely clear they're all kind of, at least all the guys I've read, are always looking back to the 14th century, specifically to the 1320s as like this great golden age of kind of when everybody was doing philosophy. And
Right.
it's just not, I've not found that to be that interesting. What you get, so you do, I think, there was a guy called Bargius. I think he is a commentary that's, I mean, he's like late 15th century, and he does, I think that is a commentary on the Ornatio. And he mentions a guy he studied with. I forget his name now. I think it starts with a W, but that guy also, I think, it doesn't survive, but he also wrote a commentary on Scotus. And then another guy is Foxel, who is English, but he did his career in Italy, and he did not write, well, he tends to write kind of commentaries on specific hard parts of Scotus. So he doesn't have a single commentary. So well, that's not true. So he did try to write a commentary on like the prologue of the Ornatio, and he's got like two different versions of commentaries on the first question, the Ornatio, but that's all he's got. And both of them are like 90 folios long. And Foxell is another one of these scholars. So he had read everything. He's always citing Meyronnes and Antonius. And this is actually kind of why I tend to focus on Antonius, Meyronnes, Benatus, and Petrus Thomae, because Foxell is talking about those four constantly, like as the four greatest Scotists. This is what Foxell says. So this is kind of where I came up with these four. But I mean, Foxell's, he'll take like the problem per se nota propositions and write a little lecture about per se nota propositions. And it's clear that he's like has a very specific like 5 paragraphs of the Ornatio in mind, because he'll like kind of paraphrase it sometimes. But so he wrote something like 15 or 20 little these treatises, and they're all like different parts of the Ornatio, which he's commenting on and kind of explicating. They're a bit hard going though, because he writes in like Ciceronian Latin, so you definitely get the like Renaissance feeling to it, except that it's still about scotistic matters. As I said, he's also the one who talks about the like Scotiste versus Bonatiste and Meyroniste.
Okay.
And that in at least in one place where he does it, it's on the divine ideas, because there was some debate in Scotus and divine ideas. He's got this idea that the divine intellect produces the divine ideas, or the like essences of creatures, and he's got like 4 instances of nature in which this happens. And Meyronnes and Peter Thomae and most of the Scotus actually reject this view. They think that because Scotus also in other places says that the divine essence represents creatures to the divine intellect instead. So in Scotus is kind of this a little bit of a conflict between representation versus production. I
Huh.
tried to resolve this because in in the Reportatio, Scotus says there's a line which he says that to produce intelligible being just means to think about something or to think about it. So everybody like took him in the strong sense and like in a logical second. Then when intellect shoots all these like essences out into space kind of thing. Whereas it seems like if you take this one line in Reportatio as normative, then maybe it just meant that like you could say that God was thinking of the divine essence, and then that's when maybe he also maybe like representation is the way to go. I think that Mastri does the same claim later on, but this is like a recurring problem in the whole Scottish tradition of like what to do with instance of nature versus representation. So like Foxall, I think, points us out that the Meyronnes, so he excoriates somebody, I forget it was, but he says that some guy is not really a Scotist on this coin. He's a Meyronnes because the Meyronnes' views are actually fairly complicated on this. I haven't really figured them out, but I mean there is stuff on it though. I mean Hannes Muller has written on it, so there's stuff you can read, but I've not. It's fairly hard. But he like distinguishes between like the Aristotelian and Platonic views of the divine ideas. And this also gets taken. Benetus just kind of like uses all this also, a way to which you can say like the Christian theologian has the Augustinian view of ideas, and that means this thing, and then other people mean other things, and quiddities are also play roles. So it's very complicated. But Peter Thomae also rejects Scotus on this point, and just like lines up texts of Scotus and says they're contradictory. And I mean, everybody talks about this problem in Scotus.
Okay.
In the 15th century. But yeah, so you get the start of maybe commentary, but like this is late. I mean, late in the century, like towards the end of the 15th century, I think actual people start writing actual commentaries. They were Nazio. I mean, Foxall doesn't quite. I'm not sure if the other guy, the other Italian does or not. Trombetta, I forget if Trombetta actually has a commentary or if it's more like just his own writing of questions. I mean, you also have to be careful because a lot of these things tend to be, there's a lot of paraphrase work out. There's like Antonius in a way, most of his works are just paraphrasing Scotus. They're not as, say, you couldn't go find the pure Antonius view as opposed to Scotus because a lot of it's just paraphrasing Scotus. I mean, Univasi is actually not the case because, of course, that's a massive problem in Scotus because of the Univasi question and Scotus' question of metaphysics is kind of chaotic. So Antonius goes to the Ornatio, but he also, I think, in that composes his own question. So there's Ornatio stuff, but his own views. That's also true of the prologue to Antonius' metaphysics. I think that's his own position.
Okay.
And there, I mean, he does have the weird claim that God and creatures agree in some being outside the soul, which is like the most extreme view I've seen any. I mean, it's what Radical Orthodoxy says. Scotus says, Scotus of course doesn't say that, but yeah, he's got kind of a weird comment there, and it seems like that's his view, that he's not just saying this to attack somebody. It's like he does think that like creatures and God are both at rest outside the soul. There's some like real agreement between them. So, but he's the only one I know that says this.
Okay. Interesting.
But yeah, long story short, yeah, I think the commentary tradition starts at the very end of the 15th century, unless there's something I've not heard of before. I mean, even what's his name, Zerbius, I think is also not a straight commentary. I think he's still kind of writing his own kind of metaphysics and then just weaving in Albert and Thomas and Scotus, and as it turns out, he even has Petrus Thomae in there. So
okay. Yeah, the only big time Scotus I can think of at around this period is Antonio Trombetta, and the reason that I have some familiarity with him is because I know that he was a contemporary of Cajetan, and Cajetan kind of bats heads with him on a number of issues. They were not so friendly frenemies is the way that I see it, because Cajetan can get quite acerbic at times. But in any case, what can you tell us about this figure Trombetta with respect to his corpus and his works on Scotus? Does it have any influence or part to play in the later centuries? Maybe this is more of a question for Dr. Goff and Dr. Pomplun, but
yeah, I mean, I've spot checked him on, say, Analogy Univasi and a couple of things, in which he kind of, it's like half original, half paraphrased from other guys. Like that he, I think, was dependent on John the Canon, who was really he's not, his actual name was Francesca Marbres, who's like a Catalan guy, slightly after Peter Thomae. Oh, one thing I should say about Peter Thomae is just the like attitude towards Thomism, which people find interesting, which is in the Dante, Peter Thomae describes Aquinas as a friend, and both Henry of Ghent and Aquinas are used, they term them as friends, and they're kind of like, he's very polite to them. But he also wrote a treatise on form, which is more natural philosophy, and there he hates Aquinas, and Aquinas is the enemy.
Oh,
It's
okay.
it's yeah, so I think the Franciscans really hated Aquinas' natural philosophy. And they seem to like his metaphysics or just not really care about his metaphysics, but like natural philosophy, they just seem to like always have hated him. So um
Maybe
yeah.
that's a question maybe for Dr. Pomplun when we get to questions of if there are any attempts at intellectual Irenicism. But maybe we could jump right into the uh, the early modern commentators. Dr. Pomplun, where do we find Scotism being developed and commented upon in the early modern period? Where exactly do we find developments of intellectual interest in Scotism?
Well, we do see it across the Franciscan family to varying degrees. Just to pick up on something that Garrett mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, um, from the very beginning of the 16th century, so basically from 1500, 1501, the constitutions of both the conventuals and observants generally recommend the study of five theologians: Alexander of Hales, Bonaventure, Richard of Middleton, Scotus, and Meyronnes. And over time, the clear preference is given to Scotus.
Mm.
Um, and often, if there are points missing in his teaching, he's supplemented with Alexander of Hales before Bonaventure. Now, the Capuchins, of course, are a special case there. They didn't recommend the study of any particular doctor in their constitutions until 1638. And then they suggest that they promoted a 4-year course of study following either Aquinas or Bonaventure. But what you often find there are theologians that will read Bonaventure in either a Thomist way or a Scotist way. And in fact, when you see some of the kind of most fierce developments of Scotism in the Mariology were written by Capuchins. So it's not, one isn't always restricted by the theology course that is mandated in one's studio. Another thing I would say very quickly is we also might need to be, also just picking up on something that Garrett said, we might need to be a little careful about our use of the term commentary here. You mentioned Cajetan's commentary on the Summa, but I don't know if I'd call that a commentary. Cajetan, it's often just some notes. There are many questions and articles upon which Cajetan doesn't say much, if anything.
Right.
Many of his most influential doctrines, take, for example, the kind of infamous idea that unbaptized children of Christian parents can be saved by the prayers of their parents, which has a long history in the church, almost condemned by the Jesuits, or who often thought it heretical. Kind of it goes through this whole kind of cycle, gets picked up by a lot of Thomist treatises, appears in the International Theological Commission's statement on limbo and so forth. And you would think that Cajetan developed this in great detail, and it's a tiny paragraph. It's just a
Right.
note. It's not even an argument. It's just like, oh well, maybe this could be the case. When you look at commentaries on Scotus, of course, we have the commentaries that were published with Wadding's edition, and those are very important, and those are often commentaries. But most often what we see is the early modern phenomena of a set of disputations that have been arranged in either an organic order according to the mind of the thinker, or It's loosely based upon the Senate's commentaries. Maybe sometimes Scotus will rearrange it to follow the order of St. Thomas's Summa to better, usually better attack him rather than better reconcile the two views. But they're not quite always commentaries. You know, what we often think about the commentarial tradition among Thomas and Scotus are not always direct commentaries.
Right.
You know, what they are usually developments that follow the same order, you know, developments of disputations that follow the same order that kind of are meant to highlight aspects of the text were you reading it.
Right.
But at any rate, you see this develop across, you know, from the beginning of the 16th century, Scotism and to a lesser degree Bonaventurism, which we can talk a little bit more about, they really they spread across the Franciscan family largely because Scotism is being mandated in various constitutions.
Right. Sorry, go
And
ahead.
the same Bonaventurism for the Capuchins a little later in the 17th century.
Do we start to see around this period of time the development of maybe like university cursus literature, that sort of volume of literature being developed by Scotist figures? I know, of course, with Jesuit and Thomas thinkers, you know, there are, of course, parallels with the Conobrichenses or John of St. Thomas's cursus or the Salmonticenses. Do we find any cursus literature, you know, university course structured around Scotus or a university centered around Bonaventure? I mean, do we find any of that kind of literature?
Yeah, certainly. You know, the most famous Scotus course is the course of philosophy and theology written by Mastri and Belluto. So they both wrote the philosophy course, and then Mastri developed the theology course. You see a similar course written by Bartolomeo Barbieri among the Capuchins, which is a Bonaventuran course.
Okay.
So yeah, you know, my experience in looking through the kind of various treatises of different religious orders is almost everyone, at least as far as I can tell, in the 17th and 18th century, followed something that looked a lot like the better known Ratio Studiorum of the Jesuits. In other words, they developed their own Ratio Studiorum that included a course of literature, a course of philosophy, and a course of theology that usually devoted a similar amount of time to each. So you often see reference to four-year theology courses in the capitular literature of Franciscans. If I'm not mistaken, when the Augustinians developed their big super course of both philosophy and theology in the 18th century, I think they even gave more time to both philosophy and theology. I think they gave, I can't remember exactly, 4 years to philosophy and 6 to theology or something, you know, something extreme. So the Jesuits weren't alone in developing these courses, you know. It was relatively standard practice, and that's what fed into the language of disputations. In my or the use of disputations, because they were used, as far as I could tell from looking at a lot of the class notes from the time, professors often ran through the material that everyone agreed upon very quickly. You know, in fact, Jesuits were often criticized for this, that they were not, they just, you know, read a mile a minute. They weren't very dynamic in that regard, but then the emphasis was on specific disputations that would illustrate some aspect of controversy, you know, that the school had a stake in.
Right.
Whether that was, you know, within the order, but more often with an eye toward other religious orders.
Okay. And When it comes to the development of Scotism in the early modern period, and we're starting to see it mandated in constitutions, where exactly geographically are we finding these developments? As I understand it, you find large swaths of Scotus developing, especially in Ireland and the Irish Scotists, and you also find parallels with the Italian Scotists. And maybe Dr. Goff, we can get your point on this, but it even seems to be that you get their own distinct flavor of Scotism starts to develop in these two regions.
Yes, well, I don't know as much about the observant tradition, but essentially, Wadding founded San Isidoro in Rome, and that comprised mainly Irish Franciscans. And with the conventual school, and of course, you have the Wadding edition of and the commentaries within the Wadding edition by major Scotists. But with respect to the conventuals, it seems as though the conventuals had kind of initially two main centers that kind of converged upon and pivoted in Rome at the what became the Seraphicum, the College of St. Bonaventure. And this presents an interesting kind of historical dilemma and development, because one, you had the major Scotistic school at Padua, and you had the complementary Thomistic school also at Padua. And this is beginning with people like Antonio Trombetta, and then later on, about 40 years later, Philip Faber or Fabri. And really, in some sense, they were kind of the pinnacle of Italian Scotistic, at least conventual thought at a major academic institution up to that point. And they, of course, interacted very heavily with Cajetan, Dominican, as well as but as well as Jesuit commentators. But in some sense, the conventual Franciscan school took on a kind of different, what should I say, a different, more speculative and systematic approach with the school of San Lorenzo in Naples. And this is out of which came about the same time, but perhaps slightly later, you have the conventual Franciscan Giuseppe da Trapani, and widely regarded as one of the greatest Scotist intellectuals of the day in the early 17th century. But strangely, we have no manuscripts, but to him is credited really kind of the leading ideas with respect to predestination, the whole philosophical distinction that kind of tries to split the difference between middle knowledge and physical premotion of the Jesuit and Dominican schools. But interestingly, we have no manuscripts. But nevertheless, he both taught alongside, but also was the teacher of the famous Angelo Volpi. And Angelo Volpi would then go on to influence subsequent generations, such as Belluto, but especially Mastri, who then went from Naples to Rome, was educated at the College of St. Bonaventure, but nevertheless remained Scotistic, and then ended up at Padua. And then, in a sense, with this Paduan strain, you have this movement from Naples to Padua that then kind of backfed into Rome. And you see this developed at the end of the 17th century with a figure like Lorenzo Brancati, who died as the librarian of the papal librarian, and wrote commentaries on the sentences ad mentem Scoti. And I think this was an important point that Trent brought up, is that when I'm thinking of commentators, or commentaries, it seems what you have at that time are more either on the model of the sentences or on the model of the Summa, Volpi, for example. You have really theological works that are intended to be complete in themselves, but really ad mentem Scoti, not so much commentaries on Scoti, but Scotus, but entire theological treatises. And then in between, and I'll have to take a step back to Rome, because there's an interesting kind of ripple thrown into the conventual Franciscan life that needs to be mentioned that pertains to Rome. But between Naples and Padua, then, you have really this entire tradition of kind of Scotistic commentators, probably most strongly rooted in Volpi, but then you find developments and continuations with modifications in figures like Mastri, Belluto, Modestus Gavazzi, who wrote two very interesting treatises, one on the Eucharist and the nature of Eucharistic sacrifice, but another one in response to a conventual confrere who is very interesting in himself, who kind of basically seems to have fought with everybody. And this is the famous Croatian Mateo Ferkius, or Ferkic, conventual Franciscan, very, very important figure and very prolific, but he liked to pick fights. But this treatise by Gavazzi,
Scotus troll, the Scotus troll of the late 17th century.
He is certainly an interesting figure. Yes, you know, if we want to segue, he was with, who was, I forget who the minister general was at the time, but it might have, I think it was Montanari, who is so important in following Filippo Gesualdi, the first great reformer of the conventual Franciscan curriculum, who published his reform in, I think, 1594 or 5, and then that was subsequently followed by Giacomo Montanari in 1620s, which is kind of the definitive ratio studiorum of the conventual school that followed the Jesuit model pretty closely, but then modified this in terms of Franciscan authorities with their own concerns. And really, it's in, at least with the conventuals, it's in Gesualdi and Montanari that you find kind of the canonical set of Franciscan authors, those 5 that Trent mentioned. But then the kind of the hermeneutical or methodological approach to the Franciscan tradition that is, again, this synthesizing approach within the school. And in Montanari's declaration or of the reform, he just simply says that students, I suppose the less academically apt students are to follow Bonaventure, and the more academically apt students are to go on for further studies, and they follow Scotus. But then he made the next move by saying that basically, if there are gaps in topics that Scotus treats, well, then we can recur to Bonaventure, because Bonaventure is already the treasury of Scotus, out of which so many Scotistic points of particularity flow. And interestingly, Forlivesi, in his long essay, but also in his big book on Mastri, his life and times, or his context, says that this was kind of a common approach of the early modern period, in which one could basically attempt to harmonize while shifting allegiance to a primary teacher, but seeing that primary teacher, in this case Scotus, as already being anticipated and in Bonaventure, and thus Bonaventure in many ways being able to be read as, or in a Scotistic manner. So Bonaventure's talking, but you're hearing Scotus, so to speak. And I think that was kind of the official canonical approach, and probably colored the way in which Bonaventure was received, but also the way in which Scotus was interpreted. And so you have this kind of 2-tier system, but nevertheless within a basic harmony. And just to finish that narrative, I think this move from Naples, stepping back a bit, to Padua, and then moving and mediating through Rome, you see a kind of, I think in one sense, you find in this conventual tradition perhaps the most interesting and perhaps in the speculative sense. And here I know the theological text better than the philosophical text, but you have both the developments in theology, but also curriculum, as well as philosophical curriculum. Because I think that perhaps the first cursus written was by Mastri and Belluto in their Cursus Philosophicus. And so this was a pedagogical innovation that became standard at least for, I would say at least for 100 years. Many editions reprinted, but this was really a very, in a sense, even though there's disagreement, this seems to be a school that is rooted in Scotus, but moving out of that Neapolitan context that really finds its roots in people like Trapani and Volpi. But stepping back just a few moments, in 1687, though, you have a conventual Franciscan elected to the papacy. And this is about almost a decade before Gesualdi and 32, 33 years before Montanari and his reform in 1620. You have Felice Peretti elected as Sixtus V. And he did something that was interesting. He declared St. Bonaventure primary doctor of the church, not just a doctor, but a primary doctor of the church, complementary to that of, in terms of authority, to that of St. Thomas. And then he founded the College of St. Bonaventure. And in the constitutions of the College of St. Bonaventure, the instructors were to lecture on the sentences of St. Bonaventure. But from what I've been able to determine, out of all of the I don't know what you'd say, the rectors, the leaders of the College of St. Bonaventure, I think there was only one genuine Bonaventurian who actually wrote a commentary on the first and second book of the sentences. But the rest of these figures, even though the Constitution was for the promulgation and propagation of St. Bonaventure, they were still producing scotists, such as Mastri, Belluto. And so this is an interesting thing, because it seems as though the Franciscan order in general, but specifically also as well with the conventuals, they were to follow Scotus. And in fact, you could not be advanced in an academic or ecclesiastical career without having demonstrated that you are an adherent of Scotus. While at the same time, their most prestigious institution in terms of the church was one founded specifically to promote St. Bonaventure. So you have this interesting tension, and perhaps also that tension within the order between the constitutions of what became the Seraphicum and the constitutions of the order also encouraged this kind of synthetic conciliatory approach between Bonaventure and developmental approach between Bonaventure and Scotus. And so I think in that respect, the Italian conventual Franciscans, there was a certain shift when Naples moved to Padua, away from the earlier generation of Trombetta and Faber. And then you have this kind of more coherent representative of a school of thought that shared very similar interests, as well as arrived at very similar conclusions. Now, Trent mentioned earlier the Capuchin thinker Bartolomeo Barbieri, and he's quite interesting because he did intend to demonstrate that Bonaventure was neither Thomas nor Scotus, and he complains all over the place that people tend to read or reduce Bonaventure, especially in the Capuchins, because of their education and I suppose the interest of the Capuchins to mark out their place as distinct from the observants and the conventuals. They tended to read Bonaventure more in a harmonious or conciliatory way with St. Thomas, where Barbieri became upset with this and wanted to become a thorough and consistent Bonaventurian. Nevertheless, I think when you read his cursus in philosophy, or his brief, rather short but very interesting 2-volume commentary on the sentences Ad Mentem Bonaventurae, you'll find that in most places he ends up siding with the conclusions of Scotus, and he very often, although at points he disagrees with somebody like Mastri, and he's a little bit later. I think Barbieri. Now, when did Mastri die? Was it the 1660s? And then Barbieri died in, I think, 1697. So he's a little bit later. But he's very amenable and very, very respectful towards Mastri, and engages in Mastri's commentaries quite extensively in order to rebut both Jesuit positions as well as especially Thomistic positions. And so he again is this kind of synthesizing eclectic while being Bonaventurian, yet nevertheless kind of follows the general Franciscan tendency towards arriving at the positions of Scotus, even if he comes from a different direction. Now, I mentioned Fercius a little bit earlier. He was the Scotus troll, but I think it was with Montanari, because he published, I think, 2 lives of Scotus.
I repent.
Go ahead.
I repent of my flippant comment. I was just joking.
No
No,
worries.
actually, I agree. He did become quite a troll. He's actually funny to read. But in 1618, 1619, and before that, he was commissioned to, I suppose, demonstrate against, I think it was Bezovius, who had written the kind of general Thomistic Dominican mythology that Scotus was buried alive, essentially, is the story, and that he must have died in despair. So he was part of that whole team that went to Germany to examine the body of Scotus, and then he wrote two apologiae for Scotus, and he ended up taking the Scotistic chair of, I believe it was metaphysics at the University of Padua, and he held that chair for something like 30 years. But sometime around the 1640s, he started getting into disputes with both John Punch, as well as Mastri and Belluto. And you see this tension where he is in a Scotistic position academically, but nevertheless you can see a clear shift away from Scotus and the controversies between Scotus towards a more Bonaventurian point of view. So by 1642-43, when he wrote his treatise on the production of the Holy Spirit, he was explicitly anti-Scotist, especially on those questions of whether or not the filioque is required to distinguish between the persons of the Son and the Spirit. So here you find a move, and this is already in the 1640s. And then by 1658, he wrote a giant book on the angels, Ad Mentem Bonaventurae, which is about 800 double column pages. And then he published a second volume in 1665 on the same topic. And these are two gigantic works wherein, it seems as though talking about the angels was really an excuse to talk about anything. And in the first volume especially, he took several opportunities to accuse the Scotists of both disobeying the Pope as well as departing from the great master Bonaventure. And I think in terms of many of the arguments, his arguments against Mastri and Belluto are not convincing. But nevertheless, you can see at the same time from within the conventual order, based upon especially papal mandate, there is this push by some figures to emphasize Bonaventure over Scotus, even over against the constitutions of the order at the time. And Fercius is interesting because Barbieri, a Capuchin, who I would say Barbieri and Fercius are the most important Bonaventurian commentators, both in terms of output as well as in terms of interest of thought of that period. And Barbieri says of all the Bonaventurian commentators leading up to the period in which he was writing in the 1650s through 1680s, he is the most faithful disciple. But Fercius himself was early on clearly a Scotist, and then he became Bonaventurian through the course of his life and decades. So it's interesting again to see that convergence, but then with, and also the problems with Bonaventurian commentators, because oftentimes there was a perception that Bonaventure really was not sufficient to stand on his own in the face of St. Thomas and Blessed John Duns Scotus. He needed to be supplemented. And Fercius and Barbieri thought, no, he doesn't need to be supplemented. But Barbieri, in a more ironic and systematic way, ends up, in a sense, not supplemented, but sublimating Bonaventure in many ways into a more scotistically amenable position. Mm-hmm. And so Trent's written at length on this, but that period, in my opinion, between say 1630 or 1640 and 1690, 92, 93, when Brancati died, those conventual Franciscans produced in their own context I would say probably the most continuous and coherent Scotistic school, just simply because there was this master-student relationship that was continued, stemming from Trapani and Volpi all the way to Brancati. But when you get past the end of the 17th century, you have figures like Dupasquier, who is explicitly saying that I'm basically commenting on the commentary of Volpi and Brancati. He says, you know, and Mastrius as well, but mainly Volpi and Brancati. When you get past that point, it seems as though the Franciscan intellectual tradition, at least amongst the conventual, becomes much more interested in positive theology and historical studies than the speculative disposition of so many of the 17th century writers.
Okay. Very, very, very interesting. And when it comes to so I know that a lot of this is happening sort of in the Italian peninsula, but do we find any developments with respect to how the Irish Scotists are approaching is there any drive in Ireland, for instance, to sort of read the writings of Scotus in continuity or even sublating Scotus into Bonaventure or Bonaventure into Scotus? The only Scotus I'm familiar with in Ireland at around this time is Luke Wadding, but I only know him because of his bringing about the collection of Scotus's writings. What exactly does the Irish Scotistic cultural climate look like? Dr. Pomplun, Dr. Goff, either of you, if you have any.
I can add a little bit there. Well, one thing to keep in mind, Hunter, is that Irish Catholics are fleeing Ireland at this time. So they're often being educated in Spain. Maybe they're staying in Spain on their way to Rome. But, you know, many of you know, the men we think of the great Irish Franciscans are doing their work. They're not doing their work in Ireland. They're doing their work in Spain or in Rome. You know, so Hugh McCoggle or Anthony Hickey, of course, John Punch would be one of these figures as well. They're you know, they're scattered throughout the world. The same is true with Irish Jesuits. You know, so that's just a note. And yeah, and we certainly see, just picking up on Jared's kind of wonderful summary, we still see centers of Scotistic studies in Paris. Claude Frazon, of course, is most famous there. One of the confessors of Louis XIV. The Scotism is flourishing in Spain, which we often think of as a Thomist stronghold. But the Franciscans have the ear of the crown, because the definition of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was of great interest to the Spanish crown. And the Franciscans had decided to support the Immaculate Conception with their chapter of 1606 at Toledo, I think. So one of the things that's very interesting about the tradition as it flourishes in Spain is that it's often taking the form of Mariological treatises. And not unlike Furcius's treatise on the angel, you know, you look at some of these great Scotist Mariologies of the 17th century, many of which are coming out of the Spanish context. They really are treatises on everything. They're meant to define the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, but there is absolutely no topic that isn't filtered through the discussion. And it really probably is as much as any debate at the time drove theology. You know, Franciscans weren't just responding to Thomists. You know, that's the standard narrative. But we have very little sense that that was in fact the history. Franciscans were a majority at all three sessions of the Council of Trent. You know, we think of the Council of Trent as a Thomist council because of the myths about Thomas being put on the altar, the Summa being put on the altar, that were created in the writing of Attorney Petrus. That's, of course, just a pious myth. The council was broadly amenable to the entire range of scholastic systems. And of course, the Franciscans were the main drivers there. The Jesuits had a somewhat of an outsized influence, I think. And the Dominicans arguably had the more talented and famous theologians, the ones that became important later. Cano, for example, Domingo de Soto and such, right? But Franciscans often drove the debates through their Mariology. It was Dominicans responding to Franciscans, sometimes just abandoning the obvious teaching of St. Thomas in order to combat the Immaculate Conception and as a dogma. So they abandon the idea that theology is a declarative science, which is clearly St. Thomas's position. It's the position of St. Bonaventure and Scotus as well, but they adopted the nominalist position so that they could avoid or try to avoid for as long as they could the definition of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. These other traditions are also very important. The Irish did the great work of presenting the text of Scotus that people used, then, well, until very recently, And of course, we have the great commentaries of Punch, who, wrote two, not just one. But we also see important developments in France and in Spain. The great tradition is the Italian tradition. I'm with Jared on that all the way. One of the things that I should add there, and I've looked around a little bit in their philosophy course, but I've spent more time in the theology course, and then I've looked at associated treatises like the great treatise on Eucharistic sacrifice by Modesto Gavazzi. But one of the things that you also see with Mastri there that I think is incredibly important is he's constructing the Scotist tradition for the reader. So in the philosophy, he's still citing Meyronnes. He's still citing people like Tartaratus and such. Now they're streamlining that. It has nothing of the complexity of the 14th century treatises that Garrett works on. They're streamlining it for teaching, but he's very concerned to get at least what they know at the time. They've lost a lot of those treatises, but he's concerned to get that in there. And this is especially important when you look at the theology, because he's given you a history of how Scotus have often seen it. So on a particular question, he might say, well, here's what Scotus says, here's what St. Thomas says, here's what Cajetan says, here's what Suarez says. This is going to be pretty standard for the time. But hear how Scotus have looked at this. There are really four ways that our tradition has tried to defend Scotus. And, he might say, so here's what Rada said. And here's what Fabri said. Well, here's what Galli and Centini say. And, well, we're not sure if we want to do it that way. Here's what Volpi says. Now, here's what Belluto says. Here's what I would probably say about that. So he lays it out. It's with at least as much of the tradition as he thinks relevant to any given, any given point. It's streamlined. I'm not always convinced he gets them right. He might take some entire treatise and reduce it to a single point. But there is a concerted effort to get the various views about how you might interpret Scotus there on the page. And I think that's just, it's kind of, at least if I'm trying to figure out some broad Scotist issue, I usually just, go right there to what Mastri says, and that'll at least give me a little, a map of approaches. Now sometimes you need to check him out, see if he's right about everyone. But he tends to be a lot more streamlined, whereas Volpe is often, I think, more profound, really, kind of elaborates more on particular issues, often more creative. But what you get in Mastri is a sense of the options that the tradition had developed to that point. And I think that's pretty important.
Can I just tag on something interesting in this development based upon what Trent has just explained? Is that he ended his comment with Volpe, and I agree with him. Volpe is very creative and very interesting, but he was oftentimes very amusingly, at least from our perspective, polemical. I remember, I've read passages where he demonstrates to his mind that St. Thomas is both a Monophysite and an Nestorian within 2 paragraphs, and it's quite amazing what he does. But you find a certain kind of, and he got into trouble for that. A Dominican, I forget whose name, wrote a 500-page complaint against Volpe, and I suspect that this is what got Volpe put on the index until corrected. But of course, I think as we know that there were no particular instances of error. It was just he needed to correct probably his attitude and tone. But I think he died prematurely around 1642-43. But you find these points that Trent made are very interesting and important, because you find in Mastri this kind of bringing together a culmination of what he saw was the best of the Scotistic tradition in terms of what you might broadly call the commentators. But when you arrive at Brancati, who is kind of the bookend of the last major figure, one could argue that Sebastian du Pasquier, who is a Frenchman, but I think his works were actually published at Padua in the late 17th century, early 18th century. With Brancati, you find where Volpe begins, in a sense, very speculative and in a very speculative and creative manner with Brancati, who explicitly states that what he is attempting to do is finish, who's in the in the highest places in the church, what he's attempting to do is actually finish the work that Volpe began 60 years earlier. Volpe was only able to get through the first 3 books, or the first up through the Incarnation. But Brancati said he wanted to finish what Volpe began, but do it in a different manner. So what Volpe does is he begins really with book 3 of the Sentences. He moves away from the Summa format and moves through book 3 and book 4. But whereas with Brancati, but more so Volpe, you have this great degree of speculation and creativity. Brancati, in some sense, is almost writing in a scholastic mode, but in a mode that begins to anticipate the what might be aspects of the new theology of the 20th century, wherein he takes a much more favorable and systematic approach to positive theology. So Volpe is just he cites a source here and then runs off. In every single paragraph of Brancati, he's citing church fathers. Moreover, he's citing more church fathers than the medieval scholastics cited, just simply because he has new texts. And so with Brancati, you find this kind of measured tone in that same tradition, trying to complete what Volpe did, who ended up on the index, and Brancati ends up on the Inquisition, basically. But in a sense, trying to remain faithful while incorporating a much broader basis of patristic sources, and intentionally doing that, which I find very interesting, because there's a certain there is, as I mentioned earlier, a certain shift towards historical and historiographical questions and positive theology once you move into the 18th and 19th centuries, especially, or at least with the conventuals.
Interesting. And if I may ask a question, both to you, Dr. Pomplun and Dr. Goff, when it comes to the Scotistic literature that's developing at around this time, and all the contributions that Maestrius and figures are making, of course, we have instances like Volpe, where it's very not an attempt at Irenicism, but do we see any attempts at a kind of compromise or Irenicism with rival Thomist or Jesuit schools.
Jared, do you want to take it? I can add a little bit.
Well, yeah. Interestingly, I suppose the first major. Okay, back to Garrett mentioned the Erfurt Franciscans. And yeah, they were all kind of writing their own sentence commentaries, but amongst many of the Erfurt Franciscans, and some of the names escape me because it's been a while since I've looked at them. But what you find in some of the analyses of the sources they're citing is that clearly they're predominantly citing Scotus most of the time, but also you'll find a large percentage, upwards of 60-70% of citations. If Scotus is the main citations, you'll find 60% of the citations with respect to Scotus being from Bonaventure and or Aquinas. And so in that sense, there was a desire to, I think there was just a general trend to being conciliatory, because I suppose there was still at the time perhaps a theological and sociological, but more importantly ecclesiastical supposition that saints and doctors are not going to fundamentally disagree on key points. And so I wonder if that was at work in the late 1500s. You have the figure of I think Constantinus Sarnano, who I believe was now my memory's failing me, but I believe he was I think he was a Jesuit who became Franciscan, was trained especially in St. Thomas, but when he entered the conventual Franciscan order, he wrote a book. It's a short treatise, and honestly, it's not very impressive in my opinion, but nevertheless, he wrote a treatise trying to reconcile all the major theological disputes or disagreements between Thomas and Scotus. And he was a personal friend, again, of Felice Peretti, who became Sixtus V. And Peretti himself had a very keen interest in what you might think of as a proto-ressourcement. He edited the text of St. Ambrose. He patronized the collected Vatican edition of the works of St. Bonaventure. He established the college there of St. Bonaventure. Now later on, and this is interesting with respect to legislation. Again, I'm speaking of the conventuals with Giacomo Montanari. Is and Marco Forlivesi points this out, is that he cites two Franciscan authors as models of how he wants theology to be approached, at least hermeneutically, in the conventual order, while at the same time giving pride of place to Scotus, and of course recapitulating into that conclusion that, well, Bonaventure's already the treasury of Scotus and generates many of the Scotistic insights. So there's clearly a hermeneutical and methodological bias with some desired outcomes. But he cites two authors from the 15th and 16th, early 16th centuries, and they're not actually conventuals. I think they were both observants, who wrote commentaries on the sentences, attempting to reconcile Thomas, Augustine, Bonaventure, and Scotus. And their names escape me. I can look them up at some point. But this was kind of the ironic approach that, at least legislatively and ideally, many of the conventuals brought to this. And so I mean, some people have even accused Mastri of being too Thomistic on several points of his philosophy and theology rather than Scotistic. I think this was, at least in part, some of the motivation with his dispute between Punch, is that he was departing from Scotus and sounding too much more like a normal Dominican or Thomistic theologian. So those are some comments. I think perhaps what actually came out, especially in a figure like Volpi, is this was more good intentions than accomplishments, but there were genuine efforts, and you find it. Matthias Hauser is another figure, 16th century figure, who wrote a massive commentary on the sentences, and I don't remember exactly how far he got, but he was trying to reconcile Bonaventure, Scotus, Aquinas, and Augustine through every question that he treats in the sentence commentary. So this was kind of it was a side project, at least, of many Franciscan thinkers to have this synthetic conciliatory approach.
Yeah, I can pick up a little bit from that. You know, it's funny that you mention Hauser. Yeah, I mean, although the stated aim is to reconcile all of these doctors, what he's actually usually doing is reconciling Thomas and Scotus. You know, those are the folks that he puts at the beginning. He kind of has collationes of all of these positions, and they just begin each disputation just has this big long list of positions and quotations that he's going to try to reconcile. You see other thing in other observants. Guillaume Erinx is a someone who did something very similar to Hauser. You see a lot of it in a kind of quirky way among the Capuchins. I don't know if I would say that the Capuchins are really actively trying to reconcile Thomas and Scotus. More what you see, at least in certain figures, here I have in mind a guy named Giuseppe Maria Zamora, who's a kind of famous Capuchin. Mark Badugno is another one. They're both kind of working 17th century, like most of these figures. What they're actually trying to do is reconcile Bonaventure and Thomas, right? The two stated doctors of their order, but within a larger Scotist horizon.
Mm.
And it's often a horizon given by these two theologomena that Jared mentioned earlier, the absolute predestination of Christ and the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. So what they often do is take those two quintessentially Scotist positions as a kind of systematic principle that they'll work both St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure into. Now, of course, they were also criticized by Capuchins who are much more interested in teaching Bonaventure ad mentem Thomae. You know, so the Capuchins really were a kind of a free-for-all. You know, many of the figures that we think of as being kind of historically Bonaventurian are often much more Thomist or actually Scotist, funny enough. And the more Thomist inclined Capuchins are often criticizing the conventuals. You know, they see strict Scotists as enemies. And they're happy to appeal to Cajetan or Francesco Silvestri, you name it. You know, they're happy to draw on Thomists as authorities. But other Capuchins, funny enough, are happy to be more conciliatory within a Scotist horizon. So you kind of have a whole range among the Capuchins. But yeah, at least in my experience, it tends to be the observants tend to have a little bit more of this.
Okay.
At least with people like Hauser and Erix, you know. But of course, you have the Capuchin Thomists too. Those people can't be forgotten.
Oh, really? I didn't even know that there were Capuchin Thomists.
Well, meaning that they're Bonaventurian, but somehow Bonaventure always agrees with Thomas. You know,
Okay.
Bonaventure of Ligonier is a famous one. Gaudens Bonton is a famous one. You know, they're often seen as Bonaventurians in the literature, but they're strongly Thomist in their orientation to a lot of things.
Interesting. Okay. Well, maybe as a few closing questions I can ask. I mean, this has been like probably one of the best interviews I've had on this podcast episode. Thank you all so very much. If I may ask, what would you say, maybe Dr. Goff, Dr. Pomplun, what would you say are some of the more popular developments that come out of the Franciscan Scotus tradition? I know we've mentioned, of course, a lot of the Mariological contributions that are happening in the later centuries, especially gearing around questions with respect to the Immaculate Conception, or maybe even with respect to the sort of co-redemptrix doctrine. What are some of one of these developments that really start to catch on in the history of philosophy and theology?
Trent, I think you should. I think you should take that. I would just sound like an advocate at this point.
Well, I don't know if I will escape that charge, but well, here I'll just say a few things in that regard. I think the Franciscan influence in the early modern period is comprehensive. I think from the Council of Trent onwards, Franciscans are driving a lot of discussion, chiefly, of course, with Mariology. It would be impossible to imagine the definition of the dogmas of the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption without Scotism and the advances of Scotism. But when you look at the 19th and 20th century, many Franciscans felt that the Feast of Christ the King was really a Scotist-inspired feast. In fact, if you look in the 20s and the 30s, many Franciscans were confident that the doctrine of the absolute predestination of Christ could be made into a dogma. And they often pointed to the Feast of Christ the King as its justification, its liturgical justification. In much the same way, a lot of what people find, I think, appealing about sophiology, a unique hypostatic order in which Christ and Mary are predestined to absolutely thought through, strong reading of wisdom literature, Proverbs and Sirach, and Wisdom of Solomon. Of course, all of that's anticipated in Scotism. Much of it is anticipated in those elements of early modern Thomism, like the Solmonticenses, that pick up on a lot of Scotist trends. One thing that's often not recognized is Blondel was a strong proponent of what he called the Franciscan thesis. It ends action, it appears again throughout his work. So the development of Blondelian Panchristism, which is going to become important for Teilhard, it's going to become important for de Lubac. That's a great example of how one develops notions that were really kind of broadly Scotist. And the Scotist reading of Colossians and Ephesians, that there becomes, kind of takes on a life of its own. Blondel himself was very taken by the Franciscan thesis, as he called it. And he was drawing on St. Francis de Sales and a lot of people that were now then in the 19th century advancing kind of Scotist arguments with far greater biblical and patristic depth than anyone in the 17th or 18th century would have argued. But this is often left out of the literature. Now, he's not developing that with Scotist metaphysics in mind. He's got his own Leibnizian concerns. It's much more French and modern, but it is strongly indebted to earlier notions of the absolute predestination of Christ. So I think all of these are quite important innovations, or shouldn't say innovations, developments that often go unrecognized.
Right. Dr. Goff, would you have anything to add to that?
Well, okay. some interesting aspects of this as well is in terms of the modern period and the liturgical movement and this kind of development of pan-Christicism or cosmic Christocentrism. I would just simply second a lot of many of the observations that Trent has already made with respect to these, but in a manner that becomes, in a sense, beyond the conclusions maybe that you find in Scotus, or he doesn't deal directly with this topic. Many of the implications are, in fact, worked out in structurally already in the 17th century, but he's right. You see a kind of recapitulation and a kind of uncredited rediscovery of these same themes in the liturgical movements and the biblical movements, wherein the kind of the universality in terms of at least the exemplary causality of the predestination of Christ through Mary absolutely begins to color, I think, what you might say, the presentation of the ordinary magisterium, at least as found in, say, the encyclicals of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, very clearly, but also expressed, I think, in terms of the catechesis on creation that you find in the New Catechism. Another interesting point too about the entire the importance of the Franciscan tradition, kind of historically and culturally, is that the Spanish situation was interesting, and there's potentially a great deal of confusion when you speak of observance and conventuals prior to 1517 and the kind of definitive break, because observance were simply a branch within the larger Franciscan family that wanted to observe the rule more strictly. And by the time you get to the exploration, the age of exploration, where especially the Spanish and the Portuguese are sending explorers, but also missionaries are coming, you find a great influence of what you might call Franciscan spirituality, a kind of preponderance of Franciscan theological interests influencing the exploration of the New World, beginning with Columbus under the patronage of Isabella of Spain. She was definitely committed to certain Franciscan ideals, and you find that Renaissance Scotistic texts, spiritual works, a very strange work by a Portuguese member of Portuguese nobility by the name of Amadeus of Silva. His Apocalypsis Nova functioned as kind of a programmatic outline for many of the early Augustinian, but especially Franciscan missionaries in the New World. And later on in the 16th century, this was published or revealed in 1502. And there's a great deal of speculation about where it came from. But the story is that Amadeus, who became confessor to Pope Sixtus IV, the first conventual Franciscan pope, he received these visions from the angel Gabriel, and he wrote them down in states of 8 different raptures. But this apocalyptic text became very important, especially in Italy, but also in the New World, as the missionaries, especially Franciscan, but also Augustinian, and later on in South America, the Jesuits took over a lot of these themes, even though St. Ignatius himself did not like the book and forbade its reading. Nevertheless, the Jesuits took over many themes. And so there was a very strong, what you might say, Scotistic coloration of the early evangelization of the Native Americans. But then you find, interestingly, in the 17th century with Maria of Agreda, and then the subsequent missionaries who came, again, mainly from Spain and Portugal at this point, her text became kind of this spiritual guidebook. I've read it said that Junipero Serra, who was an Alcantarian Franciscan, the 2 texts that he took in addition to scripture were the Missal and the Mystical City of God by Maria of Agreda, which is quite an interesting thing, because you have these 2 phases of evangelization that are rooted in these kind of Franciscanly inflected, Scotistically, to be more precise, inflected spiritual texts or visionary texts that heavily influenced how the first missionaries approached the prospect and the process of evangelization in the New World. And you find it reflected in much of the architecture and artwork in, say, Mexico, as well as in South America. So I think those are interesting aspects. And one important point, getting back to the question of the observance versus the conventuals, is that in many places, like in England, basically there was no exchange of conventuals and observance. Basically, the conventuals became observant of their own accord in England. Fairly early on. I'm talking 15th century, 16th century. Even though John Foxall was technically a conventual Franciscan, he's a bit earlier. kind of a contemporary of Sixtus IV, Amadeus, Bessarion. But in Spain, there was an expulsion of the conventuals. And so this is why you see very little impact until the 19th century of the conventuals in the evangelization. But nevertheless, these same people were kind of part of the broader stream of the Franciscan family, and in a sense were renamed or rebranded, even more so than reformed in Spain in many instances. So in Spain, you had conventuals who just then became reformed or observant, but the later term is reformed because of the actions of Philip II, not necessarily because of an absence of or a decision made freely on the part of the Franciscans. So in some sense, there are lines of continuity between, say, the Italian peninsula and Spain in terms of the broader Franciscan family that can be misperceived when you see a complete absence by the end of the 16th century of any conventuals and a kind of apparent severing of that intellectual tradition. I think that perhaps could be more apparent than real, because the distinction was from without and imposed, not so much organic and from within. And an interesting line of connection, especially with America and the development in both North and South America of the church and the whole process of evangelization, is that there's a strange personal connection between Amadeus of Silva and Maria of Agreda, both very influential figures in this process, because the sister of Amadeus is Saint Beatrice of Silva, who was canonized by Paul VI in the 1970s. But Saint Beatrice of Silva was the founder of the Conceptionist order of nuns, out of which Agreda, about 150 years later, came. So it's a strange line of continuity, highly concentrated in this kind of mode of spirituality that, to sum up what Trent was saying, was in a sense maximalist with respect to Christology and Mariology. I think that's what begins to shape and to guide Franciscan theological and developments in theology and spirituality, is this kind of maximalist disposition to affirm always what is greater, so long as it doesn't contradict scripture or tradition or the magisterium, which of course they find that principle or approach already in Scotus. So perhaps that wasn't directly pertinent, but I nevertheless find it interesting, because it has to do with something about us here in America too.
Right.
Sorry, Garrett. Sorry, Hunter. I realize you're not in America.
Not at the moment. No. But yes, absolutely. This has been an incredible discussion interview. Thank you all so much for coming on. If I may ask, the closing question, maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Smith, and then you, Dr. Pomplun, and Dr. Goff. Would you all have any resources you would recommend for those who are interested on the subject of Scotism? And this could be from a philosophical, theological, historical, sociological standpoint, both early stages and modern. Do you have any recommendations?
Well, there's no handbook.
No, there's no anthology, but yeah, sure.
I mean, yeah.
Fair.
I mean, yeah, of course, you have to read a fair bit of Scotus for a lot of it to even make sense. And then,
Well, maybe I could attenuate the question a bit. I mean, would you have any historians who are working with this time period of the early development of Scotism that you might recommend? Or
yeah, I mean, there are a number of people working kind of on this field. Just everything is very, I mean, a lot of us were still at the determining what works are genuine, what's not, and figuring out the details of their careers, and so it's there is, and there's almost no critical editions of any of this stuff either. So there is a few things in Meyronnes been published. There's like a German Latin edition of the beginning of the Conflatus, which gives a good view of his thought by Hofmeister Piesch and Hannes Müller. Stephen Dumont has written a lot on kind of the metaphysics of some of the early guys. And then, of course, a lot of this, I mean, Bill Duba and Chris Schable have written a lot on it. I've written a fair bit. But there's no like comprehensive picture
Sure,
or
sure.
introduction or anything. It's still very, very fragmentary. And I mean, even now, we have the Wadding edition, but we don't quite have like the historical Scotus, which is slightly different than the like Wadding Scotus or the Scotus of like the modern tradition. So yeah, I'm kind of
Sure. I
not very
suppose.
helpful in a way.
No, that's fine. And I suppose that is what is interesting about the Wadding edition is that a good chunk of it it isn't historically the works of Scotus, but it's much of the works that the sort of Scotus tradition, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the Scotus tradition draws upon is included in that sort of opera omnia, so to speak. I don't know if Luke Wadding did that intentionally, or if he genuinely thought these works were the writings of Scotus. Maybe that's a question unto itself. But yeah, I mean, Dr. Pomplun, would you have any recommendations?
Yeah, just to get a feel for the kind of broad Scotistic worldview. If you want to read an interesting work of theology that doesn't get you too tied up in the technicalities of Scotus's own prose, I usually recommend Jean-Francois Bonnefoy's Christ and the Cosmos, which is a large modern Scotus Christology that's focused mostly on an interpretation of the key biblical passages that Scotus used to advance their view of the absolute predestination of Christ. That's its translated title. There's a shorter work by Michael Mylock called The Primacy of Christ that introduces folks to the issue. If one's interested in the kind of patristic background to the Scotus position, there are a series of articles in Franciscan studies written by a Capuchin named Dominic Unger that I think are very helpful for getting a sense of how Scotus see the position prefigured in St. Maximus a Confessor, for example.
Right.
So, when you look at the early modern period, that becomes a little bit more challenging because, it's a niche field. Marco Forlivesi's work on Mastri, which Jared's already mentioned on a few occasions. For the metaphysics, one can start with Klaus Anderson's work on Baroque Scotus metaphysics. That's where I'd suggest people begin.
Dr. Goff?
Well, yeah, I suppose a couple of texts. I mean, if I suppose we're talking about the how the car came together, if there is a car, and I suppose for people who kind of want to drive the car, depending upon their language capacities. In English, I still appreciate Copleston's treatment of Scotus on philosophy. It seems as though Bottoni's usually I find him helpful. I do enjoy, although it's a bit breathless at times, and sometimes I think there are points of emphasis that are slightly disproportionate. I do appreciate Anthony Voss. And what's of benefit in terms of the philosophy. I'm not as happy with his book on theology, but his philosophy, it's in English. And if you read Italian, I think Luigi Meyronnes's big book, about 900 pages on the philosophy or metaphysics, more particularly, and theology of Scotus, is helpful. I also enjoy the work of an Italian philosopher, Luca Parasoli. I think he does very interesting work in bringing Scotus into conversation with modern modal theory and analytic philosophy. I've really enjoyed his work, La Vera Contraddizione. It's a short work, but I find it helpful, as at least in kind of interfacing and bringing some ideas of Scotus and application to modern philosophy that I find in many ways very useful. Who else? If you can read Latin, I think Du Pasquier's 8-volume series on the translation is basically the theology of Scotus according to the Scotists. And he's coming out of that conventual tradition, but I find as a kind of introduction to kind of how Scotus, but especially the Scotists, have received Scotus in a very accessible kind of format that's fairly concise. I think he's very useful again at application and kind of so how do we actually drive this car in a more modern context? Of course, I would, in addition to the Bonnefoy and the Mylock, I think Father Maximilian Dean's little book on the primer, it's called the Primer on a Primer on the Primacy of Christ, is quite helpful in terms of theology. I would also recommend a former member of the Scotistic Commission, Ruggero Rossini. He wrote the Mariology of Duns Scotus, which is where you think, well, this is rather narrow in topic. But when I first read the book, I thought, well, my goodness, he's actually dealing with kind of what Trent has already alluded to. He's kind of integrating and filtering all of Scotus's theology through this particular point of application. In a sense, seeing it through the lens of the perfect instance and perfect member of the theology of the economy. And I think that's a useful introduction, but also helpful in understanding the overall contours. And of course, I would recommend the works of Peter Damian Fellner, with whom I've spent a great deal of time with. The difficulty with Fellner is that his thought is difficult, and he wrote his best work when he functionally didn't have a library. So he developed a major American theological and philosophical library while he was a member of the conventuals. But then he left the conventuals, so he had all the resources, and he was familiar with the broader scope of the tradition. Sadly, not particularly the area that Garrett is dealing with, but nevertheless, he was quite familiar with the commentarial tradition of the 17th century. He had pretty good familiarity with Scotus himself and excellent familiarity with Bonaventure. But the difficulty in dealing with his writings is that he's clearly a dogmatic and systematic theologian. And lacking the resources of an academic library, he is doing a lot of work from memory and constructively. And so while I think the content is extremely profound, and I think a legitimate development and integration of the Franciscan theological tradition, in order to kind of reconstruct that, you have to have some access to the sources yourself. But I've been quite satisfied in those efforts, not at every point of reconstruction, to see, okay, yeah, I see where he's getting this now. And it does seem to be at least a reading compatible, if not directly following from Scotus directly. But of course, I would recommend his work. And in a sense, the suggestions of Du Pasquier, Rossini, and Fellner, this is kind of like where you get to the point of moving beyond historical research and reconstruction to kind of driving the car itself and bumping into other schools of thought and theology, which I find very interesting. And I think in some way to bring Scotus and to not just bring him into discussion, but to kind of unveil his pre-existing presence, and in fact, large presence looming over the entirety of contemporary theology. I think in some ways theologians are going to have to engage more directly and systematically with Scotus in discussion with other schools of theology to make him relevant and interesting to probably the majority of potential readers. Is that we're going to have to actually try to apply this and drive the car around the modern theological world. I think great work is being done in philosophy, but in theology still it's, we're kind of lagging behind a bit in making him relevant in the positive and best sense of that word.
Right. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you all so much for coming on to discuss all this.